Okay, concept 3, we are going to talk about the respiratory system. So, just a little overview, its main function is gas exchange. So, supplying the body with the oxygen it needs and then disposing of the carbon dioxide that it doesn't need. And it cannot do this without the help of the cardiovascular system or the CV system or the circulatory system, whatever you want to call it. So, what we talked about in concept 2, that is essential for understanding what we're going to talk about now. So, if you don't remember, go back and watch the cardiovascular system video because that's really important. There are a lot of structures that go into it. Main structures would be the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, lungs, and the diaphragm. I love this picture because it kind of shows that connection between concept 2 and this concept. So we see your lungs will send oxygenated blood to the heart, which your heart then sends out to your organs. Your organs, gas exchange happens here. It diffuses in the capillary beds into your different tissues and cells. And then deoxygenated blood is sent back to the heart and then to the lungs in order to get oxygenated. So if you remember from concept 2, we would say this green little pathway would be our systemic circuit through the heart, and then the red pathway would be the pulmonary circuit. But that's kind of the main overview of what's going on in the connection to the cardiovascular system. Now, when we're looking at the respiratory system, I think it's easiest to look at the structures divided into 2 functional zones. So some people divide them upper respiratory system and lower. I like the 2 functional zones a bit better, which is the conducting zone versus the respiratory zone. So the conducting zone, the whole purpose of this zone and the structures that are a part of this zone is to warm, humidify, and filter air as it travels, through the body and eventually does get to that respiratory zone. If you're in my class, as I'm talking through this, I want you to have your big body diagram for the respiratory system out and labeling the key structures. That's really important. Okay, so what happens? Where does that air enter from? Well, most of you know this. It's going to enter your nose through your nostrils, and it gets warmed and moistened as it passes through your nasal cavity. Air is going to then move through the pharynx, and which connects the nasal cavity and the mouth to your larynx or your voice box and your esophagus. So there's your larynx, and then here's your esophagus. So air will travel down the larynx to your trachea, which is like your windpipe. So how do we make sure things don't go in your esophagus or when you're eating, they don't go in your larynx? Because it looks very close together, and they are. Well, you have this piece of cartilage called the epiglottis, and when you swallow, it blocks your larynx so that your food will travel down your esophagus and get to your digestive system. And we'll talk more about your esophagus and digestion in Unit 5. Also in your conducting zone, there's a lot of other structures I could go into up here, like your sinuses are in there, and they produce mucus that drains through your nasal cavity. But I'm just going to hit the highlights because I really care about you understanding the oxygen that's coming in through this air and where is it going, how is it getting to the lungs, and then out to the rest of our bodies. That's what our focus is going to be. Okay, so we've come through the nose, the nasal cavity, down the pharynx, down the larynx. Now we're in your trachea or windpipe. Okay, so from there, your trachea splits into your right and your left bronchi, and these are what enter into the lungs. So I really like this picture because you can kind of see one. You can't really see it because it's in the lungs, and then this one's kind of almost like a cross section, so you can kind of see how it innervates the lungs. So your right bronchus would be over here, and your left bronchus over here due to the orientation of the anatomical position. Your right lung, which you can kind of see in this picture, has 3 lobes: the superior, the middle, and the inferior. And then your left lung has 2 lobes, just the superior and the inferior. I didn't think you could see it as clearly in this, so I included this picture as well, where you can definitely see the 1, 2, 3 of the right lung and then the 1, 2 of the left lung. And then your lungs are surrounded by pleurae, which, if you remember, we talked about different membranes in concept 3 of unit 1. These are just serous membranes, and they line your thoracic wall and your diaphragm. And they have this lubricating secretion they give off that allows the lungs to slide as they expand when you inhale. So if you take a breath right now, you can feel your lungs expanding as you take in all that air, but then and this secretion allows them to slide easily, so there's not that friction there. But it is sticky enough, that secretion is, to keep your lungs clinging tightly to your thoracic wall. And this is important because if air gets stuck between the lungs and the wall, kind of in that little cavity there, it can cause your lung to collapse, which if that happens spontaneously, it's called spontaneous pneumothorax. So that is kind of an important thing, and this structure is really important. We can't just glaze past it. Now, from these bronchi, the right and left bronchus, these get even further subdivided. So you can kind of see that happening here as it, like, this one starts to branch into several pieces. So those are called your lobar bronchi or your secondary bronchi. You have one that will go into each lobe. So the right lung is going to have 3 and the left should have 2. Those even further subdivide, which we can see here in this picture, and those are called segmental bronchi or tertiary bronchi. So all these it's just passageways. So we're just we're just passing the air further and further down these different passageways until eventually we get into the smallest ones, which are less than 1 millimeter, and those are called bronchioles, which you can't really see in this picture. The other thing in this picture that isn't labeled here, but we'll talk about in a minute, is the diaphragm. So that is right here, and that's a super important muscle we'll talk about. But we're going to get to your bronchioles. Okay, now we've entered the respiratory zone. So this is where gas exchange is going. We're not just conducting the air, we're going to now get it to where we can exchange it. And this happens in those bronchioles, those tiniest and smallest passageways, and the alveolar ducts and the alveoli. So your bronchioles empty into the alveolar ducts. So that would be like your bronchiole, and this would be an alveolar duct. And those alveolar ducts dead into tiny alveolar sacs that contain alveoli or alveoli, which are just thin-walled air sacs. So think of like an alveolar sac as a bunch of grapes, and then the alveoli would just be like the individual grapes that are in there. And then this is where the bulk of gas exchange occurs. And this is really important. You have around 300 million alveoli in your lungs, which gives so much surface area for gas exchange. Because carbon dioxide and oxygen, if you remember from like biology 1, and I think we even reviewed it in unit 1, concept 1, they move by simple diffusion. So we got to get them, we have to have the most surface area so that they can get in and out of the different cells that they need to get in and out of. All right, so let's talk a bit more about gas exchange. So this is just the diffusion of oxygen and CO2 between the alveoli in your lungs and the blood in your lungs. And then later on, once that oxygenated blood gets pumped through your heart and the systemic circuit to get out to your body tissues, gas exchange is going to happen between your blood and the body tissues that it arrives at or arrives to. So remember, your arteries and veins, those are important. Those feed in to each alveolar sac, with capillaries connecting to each alveoli. So if you don't remember what those things are, go review that from concept 2. So if we kind of zoom in at the alveoli, what's going on? CO2 is moving out of the blood and into the alveoli, and then oxygen is moving into the blood and out of the alveoli. So this is what would be happening in our lungs in order to get oxygen into the blood so that we have this oxygen-rich blood now that can go pump to the heart and then out to our different body tissues. And this is all happening. It's crossing something that's referred to as the respiratory membrane. So I like this picture too. It could be a little bit complicated of a diagram, but I like how it's showing everything in the whole body. It's connecting the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. So let's start up here. You take in air, you inhale or you inspire air, travels down your trachea into your bronchi, and then into your bronchioles. If we zoom in on a bronchiole, which would be in your lung, we can see that the air is going to be in these alveoli, and if we look there, that's where the air exchange is happening, with oxygen going in to the blood cells and carbon dioxide coming out. All right, so now we have oxygenated blood. Okay, now that oxygenated blood is going to follow this red. It's going to leave the lungs and go to the heart. And the heart's going to pump that blood out of its arteries to all your different organs and the tissues that make them up. And those have capillary beds there that's going to do the exchange of gas there. So this same kind of gas exchange that's happening in the alveoli is going to happen in capillary beds. And those cells are going to get the oxygen that they need. And then they're going to send out blood with carbon dioxide in it. And those are going to travel through the veins in your body back to your heart. Your heart's going to pump them through pulmonary circulation into the lungs so that they can then be oxygenated again. And here's a little zoom in of the same kind of gas exchange that's happening down here in our organs in the capillary beds. So I really like this diagram. I think it does a good job just kind of summarizing what's happening. Oh, and then of course your lungs breathe out. You expire that CO2. All right, so breathing. It's another word for it is pulmonary ventilation. How does it happen? Well, here's just a brief overview. The diaphragm, so important. That's this muscle here. It's what moves the lungs. Your lungs don't have any contractile muscle tissue because instead of contracting, they expand when you inhale. And then they release that expansion when you exhale. So we need the diaphragm to allow this expansion and relaxation of your lungs to happen. So your diaphragm separates the thoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity. So it's a nice little division right there. And here's why this is important. Volume changes in your lungs lead to pressure changes, and pressure changes cause air to move. Okay, just like we talked about in the cardiovascular system, those pressure gradients are what cause the blood to flow, and it's going to be what causes air to move in our bodies as well. So when you inhale, your diaphragm contracts, meaning your diaphragm moves down, and that makes more room for your lungs to expand as air comes in. Then when you exhale, your diaphragm's contraction gets released and your diaphragm moves kind of back upward into this U shape, and your lungs return to their normal size, which is deflated, which has a lower volume, and it pushes air out as you exhale. Another way to look at it is like this. So you could look at breathing as two phases. Inspiration, which is where air moves into your lungs. Your inspiratory muscles, which are just your external intercostal ones, they contract, and that allows the diaphragm to move lower, which increases the volume in the thoracic cavity and allows your lungs to expand and air to flow in. And then the second phase would be expiration, when air exits out of your lungs because your inspiratory muscles relax, your diaphragm rises back to where it starts, which decreases the volume in the thoracic cavity, and thus your lungs kind of recoil, if you will, and air flows out of your body, either through your nose or your mouth. Now, let's talk through breathing again, but with way more detail. So we're going to trace the flow that this air is going to take. Okay, and you don't need to write in my class this word for word. Just summarize the pathway it's taking. You can write, the locations and the arrows or something like that, or even label on your big body diagram where is it going with arrows. Okay, so your intercostal muscles contract. That pulls your ribs up, and your diaphragm contracts and moves down. And that pulls air into your body, and it's going to come in through your mouth or your nose because you can breathe in through your mouth or your nose. That air is then going to pass through the pharynx. So if it's coming through your nasal cavity, it'll go through the nasopharynx. If it's coming through your mouth, it'll go through the oral pharynx. And then it'll eventually go down our larynx and get to our trachea or windpipe. Trachea is part of the filtering process. Remember, it's part of our conducting zone. So it has tiny hair-like cilia and mucus that will try to filter the air so nothing damaging makes its way into the lungs. Then the air moves down the trachea and it splits into your right and your left bronchi. Fun fact about these, by the way, I meant to mention, your right bronchi is a little bit more like vertical up and down. So it's more likely for you to get something stuck in that one than it is on the left side, which is kind of interesting. Anyways, I digress. Your trachea is really stiff, by the way. So it stays open and it doesn't collapse every time pressure drops because there's a lot of pressure change happening as your lung volume changes and thus the pressure changes. So your trachea has this nice stiff structure so that it stays open, which we appreciate when we breathe. All right, so that air gets through the bronchi, and then it's going to make its way further and further into branching bronchioles. Once it's in the bronchioles, it goes through those alveolar ducts, and it's going to arrive at the alveoli at the end, and that's where the gas exchange occurs. Oxygen that's been pulled into the alveoli diffused through the really thin alveoli membranes and into the pulmonary capillaries to be circulated then through the heart and then to the rest of our body for cellular respiration. And then carbon dioxide that's been created by the body through cellular respiration is brought by the capillaries to the alveoli again and diffuses into them. And then your diaphragm will relax, move up, cause air, which contains that CO2 waste in your alveoli to then be exhaled. So I mentioned cellular respiration, and some of you are like, wow, this is a major throwback to Biology 1. And you would be right. And I hope you remember the whole thing in its entirety. But I'm sure that's probably not the case. So why did I bring it up? Why are we doing all this? Why do we have this cardiovascular system that's pumping blood, that's containing oxygen, or pumping out blood that contains carbon dioxide as waste? Why are we having this gas exchange and this diffusion in the alveoli and the capillaries? Why is it happening? Because our cells need energy in order to do all of their processes, and they need that energy in the form of ATP. And we can't get enough ATP unless we're going to have oxygen, and we can break down food that contains things like glucose to get the oxygen, to get the ATP that we need. Now, yes, we can break down, the resources in order to get ATP anaerobically without oxygen, but it's not the most efficient. We can get way more if we have oxygen available. So that's why we're trying to get oxygen to your cells so your cells can do cellular respiration on a cellular level. So just a review, it's the set of metabolic reactions that convert your chemical energy in the food that you eat to a usable energy called ATP for the cell. And thus, if it's for the cell, it's for your tissues, which are in your organs, which are in your organ systems, which make up your body. So it's important. Here's the equation for it. 1 glucose molecule and 6 oxygen molecules will react to make 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 6 water, and energy in the form of ATP. So that's where the oxygen and CO2 are coming in. This metabolic process is possible because of the diffusion and bulk flow of oxygen and CO2, which is accomplished by our respiratory and cardiovascular systems. So what are those words? We've mentioned diffusion several times. It's the movement of gases. But again, simple diffusion is only happening across short distances, which is why we need bulk flow. We need a method to move large amounts of gases to different structures that they can then diffuse into. And that's what we have set up in these two systems to make possible. So that is the respiratory system.